Now, since October, the focus has obviously been on Israel's genocidal rampage in Gaza. But of course, that's only part of the story. For example, we've had essentially a pogrom going on in the West Bank, which has been largely ignored. But we now have the possibility of all-out war between Israel and Lebanon. It's been rumbling on for months between Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Israel. But increasingly, there is speculation that this could explode into something much more devastating. There's a terrible history here in terms of horrible atrocities committed by Israel in Lebanon. So no better person to speak to about this than Nasser Elamine. He's editor at Al-Quds Al-Arabi and is a specialist in this whole area. So that makes sense to talk to you. So I'm really honored to speak to you, Nasser. How you doing?
Hey, thank you, and thank you for having me.
I just want to start, just because people might not know about the kind of broader context in terms of what happened with Israel and Lebanon, going back to the 80s and the invasion then. So I was just wondering if you could kind of give a kind of précis, I guess, of the kind of context and also some of the atrocities, I guess, that were committed by Israel back then.
Yeah. So actually, the first invasion of Lebanon happened in '78, before the 80s. The Israelis at the time invaded Lebanon under the pretense that it was a response to a PLO operation that killed, I think, 30 Israelis. They advanced, reached the Litani River, which is a river in the south. It's also the same line they want Hezbollah to retreat north of now. At the time, the UN managed to mediate a deal, an agreement between the PLO and Israel to retreat, to cease fire. This happened 3 years after the civil war in Lebanon, which was fought largely between the LNM, which is the Lebanese National Movement, a group of leftist and nationalist political parties, and the right-wing Christian militias, which were led by the Phalangists, who had ties to Israel. Some say that they were trained by the Israelis. The Phalangists obviously deny this. My point here is that Israel had a history of also meddling internally with Lebanon. They were obstructing deals between these parties that ended up striking or starting a civil war. This was also 8 years after the PLO relocated its headquarters to Lebanon. In 1982 was the second invasion. That was the invasion in which Israel reached Beirut, besieged Beirut for 2 months, during which the Sabra and Shatila massacre happened. It was committed by the Phalangists, but under the support of Israel, Ariel Sharon at the time. Around 3,000 Palestinians and Lebanese Shias were killed during. And this siege ended with the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon and the retreat of Israel back to the south of Lebanon, which they continued to occupy for many years afterwards. That was around the time when Hezbollah declared armed resistance, was formed and declared armed resistance against the Israelis, and managed to expel them by the year 2000. During which about 200,000 displaced Lebanese people in the south of Lebanon. There was about 80-something villages that were partially destroyed, 10 villages that were completely destroyed, and obviously endless deaths. And then 6 years later, there was the 2006 war. Israel completely demolished Lebanon, but strategically they lost that war because they couldn't achieve the primary goal they had, which was to end Hezbollah. Around 1,000 Lebanese people died during that war.
I think it's really, it's a brilliant exposition of that history. With Sabra and Shatila, Ariel Sharon, as you mentioned, his defense, I just think it just underlines the kind of, at the moment, we'll talk about, got various Israeli politicians and leaders talking about collective guilt as the basis for genocidal ideation. And at Sabra and Shatila, this is a really grim thing to just throw into a discussion. So just people should prepare themselves. But there was an example of a pregnant woman having her stomach sliced open and the fetus taken out. And that happened. and that was alleged to have happened on the 7th of October. It never happened. It was actually an example of an atrocity with Israeli complicity, because Ariel Sharon was held responsible, wasn't he, by an Israeli commission and then became prime minister.
Yeah.
I just think it's quite striking about what's happened with Hezbollah since, because Hamas is one thing, and Hamas hasn't been defeated by Israel in Gaza at all. I mean, US intelligence officials are briefing that not only have far fewer Hamas militants been killed than Israel says, but shock horror, their ranks have been replenished, because turns out if you wage a genocidal war on people, then they decide they have nothing to lose and they want to fight back. That kind of, I don't know why people are surprised. But that's one thing. But Hezbollah just on Hamas, although there's just in a different category.
Yeah, I mean, one can only look, for example, the Hezbollah that fought in the 2006 war had, I don't have the number of how many missiles they had, but almost none of those missiles were precision missiles, precision-guided missiles. And they still managed to cost Israel about $4.3 billion in damages. Since then, Hezbollah has acquired much higher amount of missiles, a lot of which are precision guided. They now produce those missiles locally, but they also partook in the Syrian civil war. And during that war, they fought continuously. There was continuous guerrilla warfare, which is essentially training, for 10 years. So not only are they now heavily armed, the Israeli estimates is around 200,000 missiles. Recently, a colleague, Ali Hashim, wrote for Foreign Policy, and he cites an Revolutionary Guard, an Iranian Revolutionary Guard source that says they have 1 million missiles. So the estimates are between the Israelis saying their enemies saying 200,000 and their allies saying 1 million. So you can imagine the number is somewhere between those two numbers, and that's much more than most armies have. In addition, they have these immensely skilled fighters. So the idea that Israel might be able to invade Lebanon through land is just incomprehensible. During 2006, they attempted it. They could not get past the first couple of villages. So yeah, there's no comparison between Hezbollah and Hamas in terms of arms, training, and essentially the capacity for destruction within Israel.
What's been going on basically since 7th of October? Well, we've seen this escalation, and that's to do with Israel's onslaught against Gaza, essentially, isn't it? That's why this has escalated.
Yeah, no, that's precisely why it escalated. I mean, Hezbollah has been very clear since then. You end the aggression against Gaza, this ends, the war in the north ends. But precisely because of these capacities that Hezbollah has acquired over the last, 18 years, they've managed to sort of impose this equation, this sort of contained battlefield. Immediately in the first month or two, the Israelis were forced to displace about 90,000 of the northern settlers. Lebanon was also forced to displace about 100,000 or 90,000 of the people living in the south. So they immediately drew out these borders for the battle, and the escalations almost always remained within these borders. Israel obviously transgressed on several occasions. They assassinated Hezbollah leaders, they assassinated a Hamas leader, but they've managed to contain it. But precisely because Hezbollah wants it to remain contained. They have no interest in an all-out war. No one in the region has any interest in an all-out war. What they want is a very specific thing: to end the war in Gaza.
So I'm wondering then, in terms of, could this just carry on indefinitely in that, Israel's official position is this is intolerable. Northern Israel is basically becoming uninhabitable because of this ongoing escalation. But you pointed out the capacity, the capabilities of Hezbollah are way beyond anything of Hamas. But equally within Lebanese society, there isn't an appetite, is there, for any form of war conflict? So what happens?
I mean, of course, there's no appetite for any conflict, but at the same time, I mean, I think what is likely to happen, it's all in Israel's hands, essentially. Israel have the problem. The problem is that they cannot convince the settlers in the north to return without real security assurances, right? They can't go to the settlers and say, you know, we've ended the war in Gaza. Now Hezbollah has decided to stop attacking us. You can come back. It's safe. Because now those people, those settlers in the north, know that Hezbollah can subvert the Iron Dome. They have drones. They have the capacity to attack them at any moment. And they have no reason to trust that Hezbollah will not do this. The Israeli government may have reason to trust them because they're aware of sort of the geopolitical constraints, but the settlers don't, and so they can't convince them to come back. And they have this plan to have the displaced people return to the north by the next school year, so October, I think. So they're stuck sort of in this deadlock. Either they approach Hezbollah, and they commit themselves to an all-out war, or some sort of, they like to call them operations, concentrated operations, to deal Hezbollah some sort of decisive blow, which is highly unlikely. At least highly unlikely without leading to immense destruction in Israel as well. Hezbollah has the capacity to attack Haifa, Tel Aviv, all these large cities, in addition to the settlements in the north. So yeah, the Israelis are stuck in this sort of deadlock. Either they have to do something about it, and I think right now the Americans are trying to sort of avoid this all-out escalation that, to the Israelis, I think even to Gantz, who just left the war cabinet, which was then later dissolved, said he's committed to some sort of operation against Hezbollah. They find it to be inevitable. So unless the Americans are capable of convincing the Israelis that this is not an inevitability, that you can somehow negotiate with Hezbollah, then it's likely to happen. On the other hand, almost immediately after the sort of talk became serious in Israel about escalating to an all-out war, the second day, I think the deputy chief of Hezbollah, Naim Qasim, came out and sort of reiterated the Hezbollah position. We do not want an all-out war, but we're willing to sort of go through with it if the Israelis insist. And immediately after, the Americans came out and sort of reasserted the association between Gaza and the Northern Front. They said, if the war in Gaza ends, the war on the Northern Front ends. So yeah, it seems like to the Israelis, this seems like an inevitability. To Hezbollah, I think they can just keep going at this pace if they needed to.
How serious do you think we should take, I mean, really blood-curdling statements from Israeli ministers, quite, again, genocidal implication about basically just destroying, laying waste to Lebanon, to Beirut and to Lebanon in general?
I mean, this depends on essentially on how unhinged Netanyahu gets, because the thing about attacking Beirut is that there's no real reason for it. There's no Hezbollah infrastructure in Beirut. In 2006, the first target they had was the airport. The reason being, or the reason they said, but also it was in a way valid, is that Hezbollah would import their weapons through the airport. This is no longer the case. Lebanon has immense borders with Syria, and they sort of have an open line from Lebanon to Iran. They're capable of importing weapons without having them pass through Beirut. So to everyone, this would appear as an immense and unjustified aggression to attack Beirut. Plus, it would entail, it would intensify the possibility of there being a regional war. Hezbollah to Iran is the equivalent, well, it's not the equivalent, but you can make this parallel. It is the equivalent of Israel to America. While the war on Gaza there was the possibility of this becoming a regional war because of the war on Gaza, but it was contained for regional geopolitical interests that sort of intervened in the Gulf and Iran and all over. But if you attack Hezbollah, Iran will have to somehow become involved, whether it's through the militias in Syria and Iraq and the resistance in Iraq and Houthis, or some other way. No one knows. But it is it will sort of amplify that possibility.
I'm just also interested in terms of how Lebanon was a training ground really for, well, the Daher Doctrine, 2006, of destroying civilian infrastructure in order to put pressure on movements which Israel obviously, well, hostile movements to Israel, basically. And it did that that was tried out in Lebanon in 2006, and that was a training ground for Gaza, wasn't it? That's, I mean, that's known as terrorism. When you destroy civilian infrastructure, target civilian targets in order to achieve a political goal, that's just terrorism, isn't it? But that's what that was their training ground, wasn't Lebanon, for what they've taken to the most extreme kind of position in Gaza.
Yeah. The only issue with that now is that you may be, like, every time the sort of the chief of Hezbollah comes out and speaks, Hassan Nasrallah, he always says you're capable of destroying Lebanon, and it's correct. They have. I don't think Hezbollah has defense capabilities that would be able to deter Israel from completely demolishing Lebanon in a matter of weeks. The only problem now is that Hezbollah is also capable of doing this to the Israelis.
Mm-hmm.
So
mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction. It's meant to be mutual deterrence. So, but if so, Hezbollah is capable of attacking all these major cities in Israel. It's capable of causing immense damage, and so the Israelis have to take that into account. It would be an unprecedented event for them to have Haifa or Tel Aviv attacked. Now the estimates are about 5,000 missiles a day over 8 months. I mean, this is just, I think this is outside of the comprehension, the imagination of Israelis, whether government, army, or people.
So finally, I mean, how do you think this will pan out? Well, do you think there's a time frame? Do you think this could just simmer on for ages? Do you think, I don't know, maybe the presidential elections is a kind of holding position?
I mean, honestly, it's difficult to tell. I think the next couple of weeks will be very decisive. The Americans are trying, I think, very hard not to allow this to escalate into a regional war, to sort of find ways for the Israelis to not have to go through with this war. And I don't think the Israelis want to. I don't think the IDF wants to. I don't think Netanyahu really wants a war like this. I mean, the options they've drawn out for themselves are almost ridiculous. They sort of I read an article, I can't remember when, Israeli newspaper, detailing what the Israeli options are right now. The first option is that they somehow, in whichever way, they end the war in Gaza, and they sort of, and that automatically ends the war in Lebanon. And so, you know, they just compromise and have it that way. No one wants this, specifically for the reason I said before, because they cannot ensure the security of the settlements, which means that the northern settlers will not return. The second option is that they strike some sort of deal with Hamas to retrieve those detained by Hamas, and then they sort of go towards a war with Lebanon. And that is, I think, what they're looking to do right now. The third is that they don't officially end the war in Gaza, but practically they do. The justification is that they've weakened Hamas enough for Hamas not to be able to sort of enact a repeat of October 7th, and so there is no real need to continue this war. They can just sort of end it, whether they can just sort of strike a deal or end it by not really end it, but only practically end it, and then sort of move all their sources towards a war in Lebanon. But in all three options, I don't see how they're able to sort of achieve any goals, any strategic goals in Lebanon.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, that's kind of the key point, isn't it? A lot of this kind of saber rattling and quite disturbing rhetoric masks the fact they've suffered a terrible strategic defeat in Gaza as is, and they would also suffer an even bigger strategic defeat if they attempted to escalate this to Lebanon. So basically, there's a correlation between how bad things have got for for Israel in terms of this row and how kind of intimidating the rhetoric is, I suppose. It's Nasser, that was such a fascinating conversation, honestly. I learned a huge amount. I know everyone listening will have learned a huge amount, the context and in terms of why this is happening, what is plausibly could happen in the coming weeks and coming months. And there hasn't been enough discussion about this, not least from people who know what they're talking about. So I really appreciate your time, Nasser. Do like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts. Do share. Make sure everyone hears this as widely as possible so they know what's going on. But Nasser, honestly, really appreciate it. That was great.
Thank you.